Love China, hate China, or just curious about China? Yeah, can you tie that into Western companies losing twice? The title of your book. Ensure that win-win doesn't mean Western companies lose twice.
Yeah.
Can you tie that into that? Because it's a very catchy phrase.
Yeah.
Win-win doesn't mean Western companies lose twice. Can you elaborate on just the meaning of that?
Well, what I really meant by that is that they first of all will lose in China.
Okay.
Ultimately,
yes.
They may experience a period of time when they appear to be doing well, but ultimately they'll lose in China. And then in many cases, they're going to lose globally in the end as well. General Motors would be a perfect example. When they went to China in the mid-'80s, Chinese government or Chinese Communist Party, in effect, forced them into technology transfer.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, at that point in time, mid-'80s, China was incapable of building an automobile that you might want to purchase.
Right.
Yeah. But ultimately, by either virtue of technology transfer or by simply learning in a very general sense from working with General Motors, their counterparts in China learned an awful lot about automobiles. And although General Motors was a dominant player in China for quite a while, in the last 10 years, they began to lose market share. And ultimately, General Motors is in the process of vacating China. And my prediction is they're going to lose globally as well, because China has done such a good job of creating overcapacity that they're now manufacturing hundreds of thousands of automobiles every year that go way beyond what the Chinese consumer can purchase. So they're there for export, and they're there at very low prices. And it's going to be hard for the existing automakers, be they German or be they American or otherwise. It's going to be very hard for them to compete against China's exports.
Does that lose twice mean you first lose in the China market and then you lose globally? Is that the twice?
Right, that's the twice, yeah.
Okay.
But it also is, I meant it in a more general way too, because often, there's a difference in terms of negotiation styles.
Right.
In the U.S., many people, not all people, by the way, many people use what we call the getting to yes model, which is, you know how that works. It's you and I are working together. We're negotiating a deal. We're both trying to make the other person successful. That's called getting to yes. And in China, I can't tell you the number of times that people would come to me and say, let's work on doing a deal together. Win-win, win-win. And I think they've just copied that phrase because they know we like to hear it. But generally speaking, when you get into a business arrangement in China, my experience has been, and the experience of many other people has been as well, that there is no win-win. They're trying to win all for their side. It's not about taking a win-win approach. It's a question of each side attempts to identify its leverage and then apply that leverage to the maximum to get the best part of the deal. And then literally every so often they reassess how things are going. And if they feel that they have more leverage now than they did before, they'll just change the deal.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, Chinese don't use contracts.
No.
And you may spend a huge amount of time negotiating a contract and paying lawyers big money, but your counterpart doesn't necessarily intend to pay attention to the contract. They intend to let things evolve as they evolve. And to the extent that they feel they're getting more leverage over you over time, they'll simply change the contract more in their in their favor.
Yeah, when I talk about this, I always say that that's the dichotomy between how Westerners negotiate and how Chinese negotiate. Is that the purpose of Western negotiations is to sign a contract,
Yeah,
and that's the end of the negotiations. But for Chinese people, the real negotiations doesn't begin until the contract is signed.
that's exactly right. The negotiation never ends.
Right.
And they're also, in my opinion, there's the feeling that if they have more leverage, they almost have a moral obligation to themselves to gouge you more. And that if you have more leverage and you don't gouge them more, they begin to think you must be either.
You must have something else up your sleeve.
Pardon me?
You must have something else up your sleeve.
That's right. Yes, exactly.
Well, the real difference is the third thing that you talk about is culture, because as Westerners, we have a different definition of honesty. We have moral and ethical dilemmas. Chinese people think in relative truths, and they don't have these ethical and moral dilemmas. They're just pragmatic.
That's right. They're more pragmatic. Having said that, it doesn't mean that you won't find Chinese culture fascinating. Meaning, first of all, it's extremely interesting because it's so different. Secondly, Chinese people are fun to be with. There's no doubt about it. and third, it's a massive learning experience for you. So you'll go to China and you'll learn these new things, and you'll say to yourself, this is a wonderful experience. And that's exactly the way I feel in retrospect, that it was a wonderful experience, probably the best 4 years of my life.
Yeah, I want to ask you another thing real quick. We're running short on time. Did you experience what I would refer to as the proverbial honeymoon period? Like when you were first there, everybody was just praising you, telling you how good you look, and praising everything that you've accomplished, and how great you are, and you could basically, they would honor your every request. And
yeah, exactly.
How long did that honeymoon period last, and when did you feel that, even for example your assistant, when did you feel that the honeymoon period was over and now they could tell you a little bit more honest feedback?
Well, my assistant, the honeymoon lasted forever, in my opinion, because she always treated me well.
Right.
She definitely treated me well. And I welcomed her honesty when she, 5 months into it, said, you're not going to be successful, and it's your own fault.
Yeah, you're too honest.
You're too honest. But she did so many things for my wife and me in terms of making our lives more comfortable. I would never fault her for that. But in terms of my business partner, our joint venture partner, it became progressively more obvious over time that they were not being forthright with us, and that they were taking complete advantage of us. And I'll give you just two quick examples. One of them was during the 2 years when we negotiated the shareholder agreement, the deal with our joint venture partner. One of the things we all stressed was neither of us will ever compete against the new entity, this joint venture. This joint venture is there to finance technology startups, and neither bank will compete against it. And sure enough, they started competing against us as soon as they thought they'd learned something by watching us or talking to us. And when I confronted them on it, this was probably in the end of the first year, when I confronted them on it and said, you promised you wouldn't compete against the joint venture, but you are. They said, oh, no, we're not competing. We're letting the customer decide.
Right.
Which was a very mysterious statement from my point of view. I couldn't figure out what that meant. But so that was one thing. Another thing was about a year into it, in the same time frame, one of the people who worked for me, one of our many, many employees, came to me and he was really upset. And he told me that one of the high-level people at our joint venture partner had just told him that they were ripping up the contract and they were insisting on negotiating a new one. And he had a letter written by this person that he was supposed to deliver to our board of directors in California, but not tell me about it. Basically saying, the letter basically said, we're not happy with the contract. We're ripping it up. We have to start over again. And that was right after we made our capital contribution. Each of the two sides contributed $100+ million to the capital base of the joint venture. It was right after we put our money in. This happened.
Well, that's when the bargaining power changes.
Right, exactly. But it were those kinds of experiences that led me to the belief that I didn't understand the way things work in China, and I needed to do a better job of preparing myself. And I faulted myself for being so naive when I went over.
Right. That leads to one of the final things that I want to ask you about is, you had mentioned that you had read like 150 something books about doing business in China or Chinese culture before you went, and there were only about 6 that you found useful. Can you tell us what those 6 were?
Oh yeah. But actually, that I must have not expressed myself clearly before. I've read closer to 200 books now, but they weren't all before I went to China. Before I went to China, I just read a handful.
Okay.
I wish that I had read more, but honestly, there weren't that many books available at the time, because American business people, when they go to China, they just don't write books about it afterwards. Journalists write the best books because journalists somehow get to the bottom of things, and academicians and government people, they focus on policy, geopolitics. They don't really focus on the kind of thing that I'm talking about in this discussion with you.
Right.
So it was hard to find information. So in that sense, I wouldn't fault myself 100%. But I do think that I was way too naive when I went over. The best book I'd read when I went over, the 2 best books that I read before I went were James McGregor, 1 Billion Customers, which is a book that came out, I think, around 2008 or something like that.
Yep.
And that book, really, I should have taken it much more seriously than I did. And the other book that I read before I went to China that I should have taken much, much more seriously was a book on negotiation style. I think it was called Chinese Commercial Negotiations. It was written by a guy who's, I think, long since passed. His name was Lucian Pye, Pye, and he taught at MIT. And he was one of the early sinologists.
Okay.
And in this book, it's a short book, his book. It's only like 100 pages or so. It talks about what you can expect you're going to encounter when you negotiate with the Chinese Communist Party. And it basically said, all is fair in love and war. And you can expect your negotiation counterpart to manipulate, to obfuscate, to mislead, to browbeat, to shame you. All of these techniques are there in order to arrive at a better end for your counterpart. And I thought to myself, this guy must have been the most jaded person I ever met. I can't believe, or ever read rather, I can't believe that those things are true. So I sort of discarded the book in my mind. But within the first year or so, I began to see that most of what Lucian Pye had written back in 1982 turned out to be exactly on the mark. Yeah.
Chinese people don't say what they mean or mean what they say. So you cannot interpret them through what you hear.
Yes. And unfortunately, what we all do when we go to foreign countries is we expect that the people that we're going to encounter are going to be like the people we're used to,
Right.
where we grew up. And the problem is it's seldom the case. And in the case of China, the differences are staggeringly large. You know, in the case of some of the European countries, there are differences, of course, but they're not as huge.
Right. I think, yeah, it's just foundationally, if you don't have any relatively similar ethical or moral guardrails, then you're speaking not just literally different languages, you're proverbially also not talking to each other in a manner that we can understand. I mean, Chinese people don't expect you to be honest to them.
No. No, in fact, one of my early insights was when for all the years I was going to China before we moved there, when I would meet government officials, I would say, our goal here at SVB is to set up a bank in China to do the same things that we do in the US. And they'd say, oh, and I'd say, we really want to help. And we want to help China build its technology sector. And we were actually sincere, Gene. You may not believe it, but we were sincere. We actually felt that way. And they would look at me like, this guy is lying to us. That can't possibly be the case.
Yeah. But from their perspective, you lying is okay.
Yeah, that's right. Because their assumption was all we want to do is make a huge amount of money. Yeah. And all the other things I'm saying are just made up.
Yeah. Almost irrelevant.
Almost irrelevant, for sure. And I actually think they begin to see me as kind of a buffoon after a while.
Well, probably, I would say they just thought of you as a typical American.
Maybe that's it.
Because they think all Westerners and Americans are just very naive about what's going on in China.
I think that's right. Yeah. I think you're right.
So, yeah, you know, this has been fascinating. I wish we could just talk all day, but can you give our listeners just summarize why people should care today about the China Business Conundrum, and especially if you're a business person, what are the main things that you've written in your book that weren't available as you were studying and preparing to understand your reality in China?
Yeah, I would have appreciated it if somebody had written a book more about negotiation styles in China. Because one of the things that I learned was, first of all, you can leave your book on getting to yes at home. The Chinese Communist Party has not read that book. So it's not going to help you. But the other thing I learned was everything in China is tit for tat. Mm-hmm. And if there is an implicit promise in either direction, make sure that your step is a small one, not a big one. In other words, you say to your Chinese partner, or your Chinese partner says to you, if you do this, I'll do this. And if I do this, you'll do this. Fine. But make sure that they take their step first, and make sure that your step isn't too big, because the bigger your step, the more leverage you're giving away.
Or yeah, it's like when you transfer the money, suddenly you lost your leverage.
Exactly. If we'd done it, $10 at a time over a 100-year period, we would have lost leverage so quickly.
Exactly.
But that's right. That would have been very, very helpful. And also, I think reading The Art of War and realizing that misleading and browbeating and manipulating are the order of the day. So expect it and interpret it that way. Um, I could have done a much better job, I think, possibly. But I don't think that the whole idea of disengaging from China is a bad one. You may say, I want to be very, very careful. That's good. You may say, I want to negotiate harder and be more hard nosed. That's good. And you may say that in the end, I may choose not to do the deal. That's good. But you have to engage with China for two different reasons. Number one is it's the other superpower.
Right.
You can't ignore the existence of 25% of the world's population. If you do, it'll be to your detriment. And the other one is you got to understand what they're up to, what they're trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish. And you'll never understand it if you just cut off the communications. So you have to engage, even if in the end, the primary purpose of engagement is understanding.
Yeah. Do you think, now let's look forward. We've been looking back through your experience. Looking forward over the next 10 years, do you think, let's just talk about business and economic success. Do you think that is more a function of what our leaders do, like what Trump and Xi are doing, or is it more of a function of Western executives having read more books like yours?
I think it's probably some of each. I think I would be wrong to reduce it to one or the other. And even though I don't really like much, if not most, of what Trump does, I will say he's the first president we've had, in my opinion, who has an intuitive sense of how to be more hard-nosed in his dealings. So in a sense, I think he's approaching things the right way with China. On the other hand, though, I'm not convinced that he has a big picture plan, or that he knows where he's trying to take us. And I also think that he engages in so much drama that a lot of Chinese people just think he's silly.
Well, that's so interesting, because the first episode of the very first podcast that I ever recorded for the China Myth podcast, the title was Donald Trump is Chinese.
Yeah, I think that's a good title. I agree with that.
And the reason is all of the things that you struggle with, that, being honest, having some moral and ethical guidelines, Trump doesn't struggle with that.
No.
He can say whatever he needs to say. So if our advice is to really interpret China as, they don't say what they mean or mean what they say, that works pretty good with our current president.
Yep, I think that's totally correct. It doesn't mean I have a lot of faith in him, but I think he's better matched to negotiating with China than some of the others have been.
Exactly. And I guess one final question is, if you wanted to put on your optimism hat, what do you think is going to happen economically between the US and China over the next 5 to 10 years? What are the real opportunities for Western companies in China, and how should they approach addressing the market in those regards?
I think that we're going to be neck and neck for indefinitely. I think that there'll be points in time where it looks like China's ahead in this area, but we're ahead in this area. And then a little later, we'll catch up and they'll catch up. And I think it's likely to be neck and neck, because both companies have huge advantages. Both companies are, in many ways, remarkably effective.
What do you think is China's primary advantage in this global economic competition?
A huge number of people is one. Secondly, a huge emphasis on education. And third, very hardworking people. Very hardworking people who are used to what I call deferred gratification. Meaning they're used to waiting for their reward in the future, not today.
Right.
Those are big advantages for China.
Yeah, that's not a problem we can easily solve here.
No, it's not. We have some advantages too, because I think that being relatively free to express ourselves and move where we want to move and do what we want to do is also a benefit, and I think that adds to innovation. So I think the diversity we have in the U.S. Personally, I feel diversity helps us innovate. The truth is, a very high percentage of the innovation in our economy has been driven by people who were born in other countries. We bring together people with different approaches, and working together, they come to great solutions. So I do think both sides have their advantages. They're not identical.
Do you believe both sides, if we just broke the world down into, there's the American side and there's the China side, do you think both sides need each other more than they need to bifurcate or separate?
Oh yeah, we would all be much better off if we could figure out how to get along better. But I think that may require different leadership on both sides.
Well, unfortunately, that's not something that you or I can affect.
No, I don't think I'm going to have much luck there.
All right, Ken. Well, this has been fascinating. We've talked for over an hour. I look forward to going back and studying what you said and creating some great content for you to, create more awareness for this book. That is what people really need to read and understand if they're going to do anything with people on the other side of the Pacific.
Well, thank you very much. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, Gene. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that. Now, if there's any confusion about what my channel is and who it's for, it's because I had to adapt to some life changes after becoming a stay-at-home dad when my son Jaden was born. What Do You Say to a Friend from China is my attempt to address our cross-cultural communication challenges through our next generation. And here's my first Mandarin Chinese language and cultural guide. Now, I still discuss improving our communications with counterparts in China, but now I include a younger audience. If you're interested in discussing anything China related, creating content, or recording a podcast together, you can comment on this post or contact me in the links in the description.